Hello, everyone. My name is Lucas Johnson, and I'd like to welcome Jenni Powell to the Lewis and Clark County, Montana's Big Read conversation about Mark Twain and the Adventures of Tom Sawyer. The Big Read is a program of the National Endowment for the Arts in partnership with Arts Midwest. It's a grant where we try to get a community to all read the same book and then discuss it via different avenues: films, art, conversations, lectures, and later tonight, how to stay in the wilderness without leaving a trace. We've had a Runaways picnic where we fed hundreds of kids, and a fence painting party, and geocaching. So Jenni, thank you for joining us.
Hi, good to be here.
Jenni Powell started her online media journey by diving headfirst into the Lonely Girl 15 community and ended up working on the groundbreaking program. She is currently a producer for YouTube, for YouTube's The New Adventures of Peter and Wendy. She was also the producer on the Emmy Award-winning Lizzie Bennet Diaries. Sorry about that. So our thesis for tonight was to discuss how Mark Twain crafted an American story world, what he used it to say about the nation, and how almost 140 years later it has shaped what it means to be American. When I think of the world that Mark Twain created in Tom Sawyer, besides the characters, there's the landscape of the story. Does the online platform create its own landscape that needs no further introduction, or does storytelling in new media, in the work that you do, still require landscape and context?
That really comes down to a question of what kind of content you're putting out there. Something like a vlogger, there really isn't any need to expand upon their world except for because they are presenting who they are, and really them and their personality is the landscape, and they're using the online tools as their way of giving that forth. So that really doesn't need a whole lot of additional context in terms of a story world. Now, when you're talking more of the scripted avenue, the really scripted comes in all different shapes and sizes, and whether you're shooting first person or it's a narrative, or obviously something like documentary style, or something like Lizzie Bennet Diaries, which was formed within the vlogger tool set. There really wasn't a lot of story world beyond the conversation Lizzie was having with her audience. There was a little bit of it in talking about going to events and their town and those kinds of things. But for the most part, no additional context is needed. Peter and Wendy's a little different. It's still shot from that first-person style, but you also have the whole world of Neverland. So in that situation, Neverland had to be built. Like, what's the rules of Neverland? Magic exists there, but in what ways?
Right.
Things of that nature. So really online entertainment runs the gamut of sometimes needing it and sometimes not. And it's really all about in the type of story you want to tell.
Now, in something like Tom Sawyer, you can get across a lot of that world building and landscapes in the narration of it. We have in fictional prose, you have all of this text that you can use to describe things. In video, especially when it's a vlog style type thing, you have a little bit less of that. Can you talk about how you do that with, say, Peter and Wendy when you do have a world to build?
Really, we can show that in things like the set, what we choose to put in the background of the set. And a lot of that is setting up because Peter and Wendy takes place in two locations. One is Peter Pan's apartment, and one is Wendy Darling's apartment. So we're kind of showing a window to Neverland through those two locations. And, with Peter Pan, he's a comic book artist. He's into a lot of geeky things. So in his background, you've got, comic panels and toys. And it's really messy because he's like a messy, frantic person. Peter Pan is actually quite similar to Tom Sawyer in a lot of ways, come to think of it.
For sure.
And I'm sure Kyle can talk on that more next week, who plays Peter Pan in Peter and Wendy. And then Wendy, her walls are light blues and soft tones, and her wardrobe really says a lot about her. So those are kinds of the ways that we're kind of building this world of Neverland through the characters that live in it.
So was there any particular, you reread Tom Sawyer recently, was there any particular aspect of that world building that stood out to you, or anything that you saw was particularly similar to, the kinds of world building that you tend to do?
Well, I can tell you my two favorite locations in the story are when they go to the island to have their adventure because they're going to go be pirates.
Right.
And then the cave, and building out that cave environment where I didn't remember that Tom Sawyer was so dark. I mean, he witnessed murder and he was trapped in a cave and almost died. Like, I was like, wow. As a kid, when I read this, I glossed over all of this.
Right.
But it really did build a world that it's like that's kids when they went on these adventures and things, like, that's the reality of, like, it was a harsh environment. And Huck Finn, for example, like, that kid had a tough life, but he was finding a way to make it work for him and still be a little boy.
Right.
And I think something like Neverland, for instance, obviously we took Neverland, we put it in a more modern environment, but a lot of when you think about Neverland, you think about, like, the adventures that Peter went on with his Lost Boys, and we wanted to honor that but modernize it in a way that made sense for today's audience. So I think we do use a lot of those tools. We just don't have the ability we don't have the flexibility of a novel in the fact that we don't have a narrator or anything like that. But I think one interesting aspect of Peter and Wendy that is semi-like a narrator is the fact that one of our cameras is Tinkerbell. So you're seeing the world through her point of view. And obviously she shouldn't say anything. She does her Tinkerbells, but there's still something there about, she's participating and showing you what this world is like.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
So I have a quote here. Gary P. Hendrickson stated, when Twain does describe a landscape, it is often either in parody of another writer or through the haze of nostalgia, which in turn is subsequently denigrated, end quote. The Simpsons parodied Tom Sawyer, and one of the things that stood out was how similar Tom and Bart are, as that is both bad boys, showing off, constantly getting into trouble, etc. What other parodies can you think of that successfully breathe new life into old characters, including your own? I mean, you're taking classic literary characters and bringing them online. What makes them work in the online Storyverse?
I think the reason that characters are constantly kind of, no matter what time period you put them in, they're recognizable, is that we've all known a bad boy in our life, if we're not one. I mean, I don't know. You seem like a bad boy to me. But, and there's always the good girl, the sweet girl, the girl next door, which would be like a Wendy Darling or Becca.
Sure.
Becky. They're just... that almost takes it to a place of psychology where it's like, for whatever reason, there are a limited number of psychological options that you will end up being, and there's a million different reasons why somebody becomes one personality over another, but it seems like it's a finite amount. So it's like when you create these characters, you'll always have a portion of the people watching that understand that personality because either they are it or they know somebody who was like that. I think that's why these certain characters, they take different forms and they got there a different way, and everyone is unique, but we all can relate.
Right, and there's a level of, it's a bit of a trope, which means when you come into a new story and even if you don't know anything else about the story, you can see that, oh, he's a bad boy. I understand that character type, and that gives you, a starting point, an easy access into that universe, into that story world.
Yeah, because if a writer chose to create a character that, say, was a serial killer but also collected stamps, and like you just this mismatch of traits that don't go together to form a complete person. You don't have that. You don't have that entryway. It's just
Right.
like, I don't
You
know
need to
anyone
spend a lot
like
more
this.
time.
Yeah, it's like, I don't know anyone like this. Why do I care?
So when you do things like Lizzie Bennet or Peter and Wendy, do you think that for the most part your online audiences know the older versions of the stories? And does that affect how they comment or discuss the new media version?
It's really interesting because I've found it's about 50-50. With Lizzie Bennet Diaries, Lizzie Bennet had a really interesting beginning in the fact that two things happened almost simultaneously when the first episode went out. One was Hank Green vlogged about it,
Right.
so a huge influx of nerd fighters came over, and then Time covered it and was specifically like, do you love Pride and Prejudice? You'll love this, and that brought a whole literary audience.
Okay.
Of Hank's audience, a large portion of them either knew enough about Pride and Prejudice to know, but a lot of them that came because they're fans of Hank and they want to see stuff that Hank promotes. And the ones who came in not having read it actually chose to read it because of the show, which
Nice.
for me, it was always, whenever a fan of the show comes up to me and they're like, oh, through you, I discovered Jane Austen. That's like ultimate, like, yes, that's what I wanted.
And then that led to the Lizzie Bennet version of the like Lizzie Bennet edition of Pride and Prejudice that you ended up publishing too, right?
Right, yeah, because in all of this, I mean, the core of the idea was, can you adapt a classic novel to YouTube and modernize it in a way that a modern audience would enjoy it?
Right.
And I think we've proven that the answer is yes. But
Very nice.
on the flip side, like, it's also an opportunity to expose people to literature that, you know, maybe they didn't know existed or only read because they had to, but now they're like, oh, but now I really want to just read it to enjoy it, which is
right.
amazing. So yeah, 50-50, I would say.
Cool. So when we read Tom Sawyer, there is that definite haze of nostalgia that I mentioned earlier. There's also a sharpness to the nostalgia that reminds the reader that reality was not awesome in Twain's memory/imagination. You work on some reality TV, which is obviously some scripted and some not. Do you think that nostalgia and scripted reality TV are the same kind of storytelling?
Yeah, besides having worked in reality TV, which from the production side, it's not super fun to work on, but I'm also a huge fan of shows like Survivor,
Right.
and those situations that put people in extreme situations or in a situation where they have to work with other people and to see how that dynamic happens. I love stuff like that. And I do think it's kind of a nostalgia type thing for me because my background is psychology. So it makes sense to me that I would gravitate towards those types of shows because it's utilizing a tool that I have in my toolbox. And I just love watching how people from different parts of life interact with each other. And I think that's the basis of a lot of reality TV is unique situations and seeing how people deal with them.
Cool.
Like one of the first reality shows was The Real World, which was literally just like, we took a bunch of people, we put them in a house. What happens? Like, it's such a simple concept, but it's so intriguing that it doesn't need to be complicated.
Right.
The people make the complications.
In an interview with Fan Voice, you had said that if you want to be a storyteller, watch films and TV shows that tell stories you want to tell and learn from them. How do different mediums of storytelling, whether that's books, online, film, affect the way that people interact with the story itself? And you've done, I mean, with a lot of the projects you work on, there's sort of that transmedia element of, you know, it goes beyond just the film. There's the the social media presences and stuff like that. How does that affect how it's received and how people interact with it?
Well, each medium is different, and different people enjoy consuming media in different ways. And what's so intriguing about transmedia storytelling, especially if it's done well, is that very few of your audience are going to consume every single piece of it.
Right.
But you've built out this great playground where your community can choose how deep they want to go. We were very cognizant of that on both Lizzie Bennet and Peter and Wendy, that it's like, look, there's the show, which is a web series, which if you just want to casually sit back and watch the story unfold, you can do that. But we have these other areas that you can play in if you choose, which is, hey, I would like the opportunity to actually talk to Lizzie. I'll follow her Facebook account, or I'll follow her Twitter, and I'll interject things, and maybe she'll talk back to me. That's a very specific type of audience member.
Right.
Clearly, that's my jam, because I mean that's how I got started in all of this, was finding Lonely Girl 15 and seeing that, oh, you can take stories and tell them in an interactive way. I just am fascinated by that. But that's very different from when I'm going to go to the movie and watch X-Men. Like I'm not going to be tweeting at Wolverine while I'm watching the movie. It's all about different levels of storytelling and what audience level you want to interject yourself in. And it can be different. Like, watching Sleepy Hollow is very different from watching The Voice.
Right. So on that note, I have another quote here from Simon Schama, which is, "Landscapes are culture before they are nature, constructs of the imagination projected onto wood and water and rock." And talking about sort of the changing types of media we use to tell stories, Twain's 1870s culture clearly speaks through his novel. How does our culture speak through web series and vloggers and these kinds of online storytelling that you're dealing with?
I think the big thing that our culture has set up is that we are in a culture that wants these deeper storytelling experiences. I mean, obviously, Mark Twain couldn't do a transmedia story unless he was like, here's the book, and then, go check out the newspaper articles, and I left something at the point, go pick it up. Like, he could have, there were tools that he could have used, but I just don't think the culture was ready for it at that time. We're in a time that it's a really interesting merging of culture and technology, where we've really embraced it and chosen to embrace it. I mean, the fact that you and I can have this conversation right now when we're probably not millions of miles, but we're far apart from each other, and we can have this we can have this discussion with one another. I think it's easier to get to larger audiences now because of the technology available to us.
Now, Tom Sawyer is sort of this landmark in American storytelling, the American story. Everyone sort of knows of it at the very least. Many people have read it. Do you see what you're doing as part of that conversation, that overall conversation of sort of of an American story? Or, I mean, Lizzie Bennet was adapted from Jane Austen. Is there a different feel to that? How does what you're doing fit in with that? And maybe do you even, how much is Mark Twain and Tom Sawyer important to today's culture?
Well, I think the shows I do are American in the sense that we are creating them in America, but we're not necessarily saying only Americans will get this show, which again I think is part of this whole culture we have, which is we can reach a global audience. I mean, we have fans in Brazil, Paraguay, like all across the world who can completely understand our show and relate to it. And not, I mean, I don't think there's any time that like Peter Pan goes, "Go America!" It's just the show happens to be set in an American town. So yeah, I don't think nowadays it's so much about pushing forward an American ideal as it is I have a story and I want to tell it, and whoever wants to come experience it can. If that makes sense.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so here's the $1 million question. If you were to adapt Tom Sawyer to sort of an online video thing or any kind of new media project, new media, what would you do, and like how would you take that world and bring it to the modern day? More interestingly, maybe what parts of that world do you think are the most important to include in a new adaptation?
Yeah, if I were to do Tom Sawyer for a web series, I'd still keep it first person because I think Tom is a boisterous enough character that he's the type of person who would vlog, but different from Lizzie Bennet, who did it very privately in the comfort of her own room. I think he takes the camera with him everywhere he goes. And maybe he's a documentarian, and he's like, I'm going to make my millions by documenting these adventures I'm going to go on with my buddies. But yeah, that's how I would do it. He would have the camera with him all the time. It's always running.
That would be a lot of fun.
Because he wants to capture everything. And, because I think it's still so important to keep, going to the island and surviving off the land and being foolish enough to get lost in a cave. Like, can you imagine the vlogs in the cave? Heartbreaking and so scary. So
that would be a lot of fun for sure.
So okay, who wants to do it? Let's do this.
Got to be some money for it somewhere.
Call me, money people.
So let's see if I have any other questions here for you.
Ooh.
Yeah, so one of the themes of this discussion is the idea that what Twain said about the nation and how almost 140 years later it has shaped what it means to be American. Is today's storytelling similar to Twain's creation? How is it different? We touched on that a little bit before with sort of the idea that it's not just about the Americanness, but it's still speaking to our culture.
Yeah. That's a tough one.
I mean, Twain
so hard because, like, being in it, like, I'm doing these things. I don't always, like, think, like, why am I doing these? Why am I picking what I pick? Like,
I mean, Twain. One of the things Twain did was, I mean, in a lot of his writing, he very carefully, picked the scenes that he wanted to tell and show as a not just an examination of American culture, but in some cases very much critique of it. Is there any of that in what you're doing as well?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, especially in Peter and Wendy, we're making very clear choices, and like Peter and Wendy is an exploration of growing up versus not growing up. And so, every scene we write and each character that comes into the world has to have their own journey in that way. Like, are they going to choose to grow up, or are they going to choose to stay irresponsible and young? Or is there a balance somewhere in there? And I think long term, I think that's kind of where the story is going, is saying that, like, you can live a very joyful, childlike life and still be responsible and pay your bills so you can keep the lights on.
It's an important message.
Yeah. So, and I think that's in a lot of storytelling. There's a lot of, I notice a lot in stories today, there's a lot talking about being prideful of whatever thing you enjoy and love, whether that be, like, I'm proud to be a cosplayer, I love Doctor Who, like, And maybe that's just because I spend a lot of time in fan communities, and there's a lot of that. But I don't know. I don't think it's just that. I think, especially with the things like the big comic book movies that are becoming very popular, like there's a lot of like things that used to be looked down upon are now looked at with pride. And I think that's a big theme that we're seeing in our culture right now, which I think is amazing because I love all those things.
That's awesome. And I think we'll be talking a bit more about sort of that theme of growing up or not in connection with Tom Sawyer next week, because Kyle, who is the co-creator of the New Adventures of Peter and Wendy, as well as who plays Peter Pan, is going to be our special guest next week for the online discussion. So that'll be awesome. And I think that's all I have for you. So thank you, Jenny, for sharing your time and joining us in this conversation. And for anyone watching, TomSawyerBigRead.com has the information on the upcoming two further online discussions. And if you want to take part, you can contact us. We can get questions from you for our panelists. And we'll see you next week. Thanks so much, Jenny.
Thank you. I had a great time.
Awesome.